My husband handed me a folded piece of paper across the kitchen table without even looking up from his phone. No good morning. No, how did you sleep? Just a paper slid across the granite like he was passing me a grocery list. I unfolded it and saw the words, "Petition for divorce," printed at the top in clean legal font. I set it down carefully, smoothed the crease with my thumb, and said, "Okay." He finally looked up. He'd expected tears, I think, maybe screaming. He got neither. "Okay," he repeated. "Okay," I said again, and poured myself a second cup of coffee. What my husband didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he'd stopped paying attention to me years ago, was that I had been quietly building something he would never be able to touch. And the moment he slid that paper across the table, every piece of my plan locked into place. My name is Claire Bouchard. I'm 34 years old, and I grew up in a small city outside of Ottawa, where everyone knew everyone, which meant everyone knew everyone's business too. My mother was a seamstress who worked from a converted sunroom. My father drove for the municipality for 30 years. They were practical people who believed that the quietest person in the room was usually the one paying the closest attention. I think about that a lot now. I met my husband, Daniel, when I was 22. He was 26, recently promoted at an engineering firm downtown, and he had this easy confidence that I mistook for steadiness. We dated for 2 years and married when I was 24. It was a small wedding, which I planned mostly alone because Daniel said he didn't care about flowers or catering as long as there was an open bar. My sister, Renee, was my maid of honor. She caught my bouquet, laughed about it, and said, "God, I hope that's not an omen." She was my best friend first, long before she was my sister in the formal sense that weddings make people feel. We're 3 years apart. Growing up, we shared a bedroom, shared secrets, shared everything. When our parents went through a rough patch in their marriage, it was Renee and I who stayed up late talking each other through it. When I got into the graphic design program at Carleton, she drove me to orientation and cried in the parking lot, then called me that night to pretend she hadn't. That's the kind of sister she was. I should explain what I do, because it matters to what comes next. I'm a graphic designer, but I've also been licensing digital art and surface patterns since I was 26. What that means practically is that the illustrations I create get sold to textile companies, stationery brands, wallpaper manufacturers, home decor retailers. They pay licensing fees to use my work, and those fees accumulate. When I started, I was making maybe $800 a month from it. I kept it in a separate account because I'd grown up watching my mother keep her sewing earnings separate from the household budget. She said it wasn't about secrecy, it was about self-preservation. I thought I understood what she meant. I didn't fully understand until I needed it. In the first 2 years of our marriage, Daniel and I were genuinely happy, or at least I was. He worked long hours, and I worked from home, which meant I handled most of the domestic side of things: groceries, appointments, managing the bills, calling the landlord when the radiator made that sound again. I didn't mind it. I liked having a routine. I liked our little apartment near the Rideau River with the warped kitchen floor and the window that stuck in summer. Things started shifting when Renee moved back to Ottawa. She'd been in Vancouver for 3 years, working in marketing, and when her company downsized, she came home. She stayed with us for a month while she looked for a place, and during that month something changed in the air of our apartment that I couldn't name at first. Daniel started staying up after I went to bed. He started laughing more, in this particular way, the way you laugh when someone has just said something that feels meant only for you. He started finding reasons to be in whatever room Renee was in. I noticed, and then I told myself I was being paranoid, which is the thing we do when we're not ready to know what we already know. Renee found an apartment 20 minutes away and moved out. I exhaled. Things seemed to settle. But they didn't settle. They just went quiet in the way that a storm goes quiet right before it gets serious. Daniel started working late on Thursdays. Then Thursdays became Thursdays and Tuesdays. He said there was a major infrastructure contract that required extra hours. I believed him, partly because I wanted to and partly because I was busy. My licensing income had been growing steadily, and I'd just signed a contract with a mid-sized Canadian stationery company that wanted an exclusive line. I was focused. I was building. I wasn't watching closely enough. The moment I knew for certain was a Thursday evening in March, about 2 years after Renee had moved out. I'd tried calling her to ask about our mother's upcoming birthday, and she didn't answer. Half an hour later, I tried Daniel. He didn't answer either. I sat with that coincidence for a long time before I opened my laptop and logged into the shared family calendar we'd set up years ago. Daniel had blocked off Thursday evenings as work project meetings. But 2 weeks prior, he'd accidentally added a restaurant reservation to the wrong calendar before deleting it. He didn't know I'd seen the notification before it disappeared. I went to that restaurant the following Thursday and sat at the bar with a glass of wine and a design brief I pretended to read. They came in at 7:15. They sat by the window. Renee reached across the table and touched his hand. I finished my wine, paid my tab, and drove home. Here is what I did not do. I did not cry. I did not call either of them. I did not post anything online or confide in anyone who might say something that would get back to them. What I did was sit in our warped floor kitchen for 2 hours and think very clearly about what I wanted and what I was going to need to make it happen. I called my accountant the next morning. My licensing income at that point was sitting at around $60,000 a year, all of it in my personal account, which had always been separate. I asked her what I needed to do to structure things properly before a potential legal process. She walked me through it. I took notes. I started building. What I mean by building is this. Over the following 18 months, I worked harder than I ever had. I landed 3 new licensing contracts, including one with a large American home goods brand whose name you would recognize. I started doing commissioned work for a Montreal-based children's book publisher. I hired a licensing agent in Toronto who, in her first 8 months working with me, tripled the volume of my passive income. By the time Daniel slid that divorce petition across the table, my annual income was just under $280,000. He thought I made maybe $40,000, maybe less. He'd stopped asking. During those 18 months, I also did something else. I documented. I kept records of every transferred responsibility, every household cost I covered alone, every time he came home smelling like a restaurant I hadn't suggested, every voicemail I let go to transcription. I'm a detail person. It's what makes me good at pattern design. It's also what made me very good at this. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my mother, not my friends, especially not Renee. When I said okay to the divorce petition, Daniel assumed he had all the power. He'd been the one with the professional title and the salary people could see. He'd been the one who handled the investment account we'd opened together, the one who talked to the financial planner at the bank, the one who made comments at dinner parties about the market in a tone that said, "I'm the one who understands money here." He'd signed us onto a mortgage for a house we bought 2 years into the marriage, and he assumed, I'm certain, that that house was his leverage. What he didn't know was that the down payment for that house had come from my licensing income. I had been the one to transfer the funds to our joint account before closing. He'd been out of town for a work thing that week and had simply signed the paperwork I'd scanned and emailed him. He'd never asked where the down payment came from because he'd assumed it came from the savings we'd pooled together. It hadn't. It had come from me. My lawyer was a woman named Patricia, who had the energy of someone who had heard every possible version of this story and found all of them interesting. When I laid out my documentation in her office, she was quiet for a long moment and then said, "You've been very organized." "I had time," I said. We filed a response to the divorce petition the following week. I had also, in the days between receiving the petition and filing our response, quietly reached out to the property management company that held the lease on the downtown condo. Daniel had recently signed for himself and Renee, the one he thought I didn't know about. I didn't do anything with that information. I just held it, the way you hold a card you're not ready to play. The weeks after I filed were oddly peaceful. Daniel had apparently expected the process to be quick and clean. He'd told me, in one of the few direct conversations we had about it, that he thought we should keep things simple. No lawyers, just mediation. He'd been decent about it, he said. He wasn't trying to make things difficult. I smiled and said I preferred to have proper legal representation. Thanks. He didn't like that. His tone shifted. He said he thought I was being vindictive, which struck me as an interesting choice of words from a man who had been taking my sister to restaurants on Thursday nights for at least 2 years. 2 months after the petition, his lawyer contacted Patricia about the division of the house. They suggested a split that assumed Daniel had contributed more to the purchase. Patricia sent back a document showing the source of the down payment. There was a long pause from their side, then a counteroffer, then another. Then Daniel called me directly, which Patricia had told him not to do, and his voice had changed completely. The easy confidence was gone. He sounded like someone standing in a room that had turned out to be smaller than he thought. "Where did that money come from?" he said. "My work?" I said. "You never told me you had that kind of money." "You never asked," I said, and hung up. What happened next was not something I planned, though I'm not sorry it happened. My mother, who is a quiet woman with the memory of an accountant, had apparently been watching the situation with her own kind of patience. She called Renee one afternoon and asked her directly whether it was true, what she'd heard. Renee didn't deny it. She said she and Daniel had fallen in love, that it was complicated, that she hoped Maman would understand. My mother said, "I understand exactly what you are," and hung up. I didn't ask her to do that, but I won't pretend I wasn't grateful. Renee called me that same evening. I didn't answer. She called 4 more times. She sent a long message that I read once and didn't respond to. It said she hadn't meant for things to happen this way. It said she hoped that one day I would be able to understand what it felt like to have feelings you couldn't control. I thought about that for a while. I know what it feels like to have feelings you can't control. I felt them sitting at a bar watching my husband and my sister share a meal that I was never supposed to know about. The difference is what you do with those feelings. You can act on them impulsively, carelessly, the way Renee did, and burn down things that took decades to grow. Or you can sit quietly in your kitchen for 2 hours and decide to build something they can never reach. The divorce was finalized 8 months after Daniel filed the petition. The settlement reflected the actual financial history of the marriage. Daniel got less than he'd expected. I kept the house, bought out his share at a rate that reflected his actual contribution, and walked away with my licensing portfolio fully intact, because it had always been mine and had never been marital property in the way he'd assumed it would be. He and Renee moved into the condo. I heard through my mother that they'd had a rough few months. Apparently Daniel had assumed Renee was better off financially than she was, and Renee had assumed Daniel was more stable than he turned out to be once the marriage settlement went the way it did. I didn't seek out that information. It came to me the way information does in small cities, through networks of people who knew people. What I want to tell you about is what happened 8 months after the divorce was finalized, because this is the part of the story I didn't expect, and in some ways it is the most important part. My father's birthday fell in early November, and my mother organized a small dinner at the house I grew up in. She invited me. She did not invite Renee, which was a choice I had not asked her to make but which she made anyway, quietly and without explanation. My aunt was there, my parents' longtime friends the Tremblays, and my cousin Isabel who'd driven up from Kingston. What I did not know was that Renee showed up anyway. She arrived 45 minutes into dinner without calling first, holding a bottle of wine and wearing an expression I recognized from childhood, the one she used when she wanted something, and was approaching it sideways. My mother opened the door, and they spoke quietly in the front hall for a moment. Then my mother said, in a voice that carried perfectly into the dining room, "This is your father's birthday dinner, and Claire is here. You should have called." There was a pause. Then the door closed. Renee had not been invited in. I sat at that table and looked at the food on my plate and felt something I can only describe as a very old sadness finally finishing. Not bitterness, not satisfaction, just the end of something. Later that evening, my cousin Isabel sat beside me on the back porch and asked me how I was really doing. Isabel is an emergency room nurse in Kingston. She does not traffic in vague reassurances. I'm okay, I said. I'm actually okay. Your income really is that high? She asked. She'd heard fragments. Higher now than when they divorced me, I said, and we both laughed. I have thought, since then, about what I would have done differently. The answer, honestly, is very little, not because I was perfect, but because the things I did right were the things that kept me intact. I kept my finances separate because my mother had taught me to. I documented because I am wired to notice patterns. I waited until I was ready because I knew that acting too soon would cost me more than waiting. But I would tell myself, if I could go back, to watch more closely in the early years. The signs were there before I saw them. The way Daniel would redirect conversations about my work. The way he'd nod when I mentioned a new contract and then immediately talk about something else. The way Renee, over the years, had started calling less often unless she had a reason. Relationships don't betray you all at once. They betray you slowly, in small gestures, in the space between what someone says and what they mean. I'm telling you this because I know some of you listening are in the middle of it right now. You're at the point where something feels wrong, but you don't have the evidence yet, and you're second-guessing yourself because this person is someone you trusted completely. I want you to know that your instincts are not melodrama. The feeling that something has shifted is usually information. The other thing I want to say is about the money, because I know that's where some of you are. Financial independence inside a marriage is not a betrayal of the marriage. It is not suspicious or cold or evidence that you were never committed. What it is a foundation, the thing that keeps you standing when everything else gives way. My mother kept her sewing money separate for 30 years, and my parents are still married. She will tell you herself that the account was never about leaving. It was about knowing she could. That knowledge changed the entire shape of how she showed up in the marriage, and she believes it made her a better partner, not a worse one. I don't know what would have happened to me if I hadn't had that income, structured the way it was, when Daniel handed me that paper. I know I would have been in a very different legal position. I know the settlement would have looked very different. I know I would have been negotiating from fear instead of from clarity. And I know what decisions made in fear usually cost us. What my licensing income gave me was not just money. It gave me time. Time to think, time to document, time to build, before I ever needed to use what I'd built. That time was the real resource. The money was just what made the time possible. A few things have happened since the divorce that I'll tell you briefly. Daniel and Renee are still together, as far as I know. My mother has seen Renee twice, once at a family obligation that couldn't be avoided, once briefly at the grocery store, and they exchanged the minimum necessary words. That is my mother's right and her choice. I have not told her what to do about her own daughter. My licensing agent negotiated a multi-year contract with a major Canadian home decor brand last spring that changed my income in a way I'm still adjusting to. The children's book work led to a collaboration with a publisher in Toronto that I'm not allowed to announce yet, but that I'm very proud of. I bought out Daniel's share of the house, and I still live here, with the warped kitchen floor and the window that sticks in summer. I've repainted the living room a color called Soft Harbor, which is a particular shade of blue-gray that took me 3 months to choose. It is perfect. I have a person in my life now who knows what I do and asks about it with genuine curiosity. Who asks follow-up questions. Who remembers what I tell him from one conversation to the next. I don't know yet what that becomes. I'm in no hurry. I've learned to be patient about the things that matter. Renee sent me a message last month. It was shorter than the previous ones. It said she missed me, and that she thought about me more than I probably knew. I read it and sat with it for a while, the way I sit with all complicated things now, and I have not responded yet. I'm not sure I will. Missing someone and being safe to let back in are two very different things, and I have learned I am still learning that I am allowed to know the difference. There is something I heard once that I have returned to many times since that night in March when I sat in my kitchen and decided what to do next. It was something my mother said when I was young, about a neighbor who'd gone through a hard ending and come through it better than anyone expected. She said, Some people go quiet because they have nothing left to say. Others go quiet because they're paying attention. I have been paying attention for a long time. I am still paying attention now. And if you are someone who feels invisible in your own life, right now, overlooked, underestimated, quietly set aside by the people who were supposed to choose you, I want you to hear this. Invisible is not the same as powerless. The two can feel identical from the inside, but they are not the same. One is about how others see you. The other is about what you actually have. Know what you actually have. Build what you don't yet. Go quiet if you need to. Pay attention. The table turns, and when it does, you want to be ready.